And you're tuned to WZBC in Newton, 90.3 FM. One of the issues that the police killing of an unarmed African-American man in Ferguson, Missouri, has brought to national attention is the militarization of local police forces. Department of Homeland Security, especially, and after 9/11, began to send money down to local police forces, including regional intelligence centers, including some in Boston, the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, these things known as fusion centers, to do surveillance and monitoring and to share surveillance and monitoring and information among police departments, agencies, the FBI, national, state, and federal and local police forces and agencies, but also the weaponization, the Humvees, the giant black trucks that showed up, for example, at the Boston Red Sox pennant games and World Series games. In fact, even the pepper ball guns that were used that evening in Boston near Fenway Park when young Emerson College journalism student Victoria Snellgrove was out celebrating the Red Sox, like many dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of people were right in that region, and thousands upon thousands of people around the greater Boston area were. But she and other people were there. They were climbing some kind of a fence and celebrating, actually happy, not rioting, not upset, celebrating. Well, one Boston police officer, was he well trained? Had a pepper ball gun, and he shot it, and it hit Victoria Snellgrove, this young Emerson College student studying journalism, hit Victoria Snellgrove in the eyeball. And that pepper ball gun, that less than lethal force weapon, killed the Emerson College student Victoria Snellgrove that night at Fenway Park in Boston. So this is just one issue, one event that happened that as a result of the weaponization of a local police force. But it's been going on for many years. And our next guest has been writing about it for quite a while. Michael Shank is the Associate Director for Legislative Affairs at the Friends Committee on National Legislation in Washington, D.C. He's also adjunct faculty and board member at George Mason University School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. He served previously for several years as a congressional staffer, working as Congressman Michael Honda's Senior Policy Advisor and Communications Director. Michael Shank wrote, along with Elizabeth R. Beavers, in the New York Times, an op editorial on August 14th, pointing out that Ferguson, Missouri, had become a virtual war zone. In the wake of the shooting of the unarmed black teenager, Michael Brown, outsize armored vehicles have lined streets and tear gas has filled the air. Officers dressed in camouflage uniforms from Ferguson's 53-person police force have pointed M16 automatic weapons at the very citizens they are sworn to protect and to serve. I'm very glad we have Michael Shank with us today. Michael, thank you for joining us and welcome.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's a fascinating subject, and you've been writing about it for a while, including an article you co-wrote for U.S. News and World Report with Congressman Hank Johnson about this. And you had some time as a congressional staffer yourself, not for Hank Johnson, as I understand it, but as a Democratic representative and an African-American representative for Georgia. How much success is Hank Johnson having, and are you having, in talking with congressmen about this?
Well, we've been thinking about this issue and writing about this issue for the last year. Last fall, we ran some articles in The Guardian and Reuters about the militarization of our U.S. police forces. We have concern about two programs that you've identified. One is through the Department of Defense, called the 1033 program, which gives war zone equipment, so that's tanks, Humvees, armored personnel carriers, MRAPs, which stands for mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, which you see in the war zone in Afghanistan and Iraq. Those are coming back, along with assault weapons, drones, helicopters, grenade launchers, to U.S. police forces. They're gifted free through this 1033 program. And this is expensive equipment that the taxpayers then have to do maintenance on and pay for and actually get the delivery. They have to pay for the delivery of these MRAPs, armored personnel carriers, tanks, helicopters, to towns that are as small as 16,000 that are getting these MRAPs. That's one program that we've been raising concerns about. The other program is through the Department of Homeland Security, these terrorism grants. $34 billion has been given to U.S. police forces to buy whatever equipment they want. So it's a little bit like Christmas and boys with their toys. They're getting a lot of equipment that is not only militarizing the police force, but taxpayers are having to pay for the maintenance of. So Hank Johnson really stepped up to the plate earlier this year, pre-Ferguson, and drafted some legislation that he's going to introduce September after Congress comes back from recess that would limit the transfer of all the weapons that I've talked about so that our U.S. police forces stay the civilian-led police force that they are and not become a military.
Another local example of what happens with some of this multi-million-dollar equipment, I heard from a former county enforcement officer in Middlesex County, the county that's sort of just northwest of Boston, that the Middlesex County jail system has the Billerica prison, and while it was being run by the sheriff at the time, Sheriff DePaula, who actually committed suicide a few years ago on the day after Thanksgiving, but Sheriff Jimmy DePaula and his Middlesex County Jail Department had this huge, gigantic black bus. I don't know if you maybe call these things an assault bus. A big, black, square, gigantic, like a tour bus for a heavy metal rock band, all black, but filled with police paraphernalia, weapons, and monitoring computers and equipment. And so they got this after 9/11, after the Department of Homeland Security sent down all this money. And that bus in tame little Middlesex County, which is, it's not a poor county. That bus sat there in Billerica at the Middlesex County Jail there, sat behind the jail ultimately after they took it out for a few spins until the tires went flat. And so this kind of equipment use, and I've seen similar assault buses used at the Boston Red Sox games in Boston, in addition to potentially being used against mere citizen peaceful protesters, some of it also is just, it's not even useful. Can't justify the tens of millions of dollars being spent on it. Is that what you see in a pattern in the country?
That's right. So the bill that I've been talking about with Hank Johnson's office would also look at the waste, fraud, and abuse and lack of accountability in these programs. And keep in mind, the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security are the two federal agencies that haven't been audited and claim they can't be audited until 2017 or 2018. So the issue of waste, fraud, and abuse is key. And in this weaponization work, particularly important, a sheriff in Illinois, for example, was lending out the assault rifles that he got through the 1033 program. A lot of the weapons are being sold on eBay or given away to friends. A high volume of weapons aren't accounted for in the millions. So either the police force actually doesn't need it, or the police chiefs or the county sheriffs are giving it away. Take South Carolina. Richland County Sheriff acquired a tank with 360-degree rotating machine gun turrets. They called it the Peacemaker, perhaps sardonically. But you see countless stories of unaccounted for weapons being given to friends, sold on eBay, and there's very little accountability. The Department of Defense claims to have these state coordinators where they're supposed to conduct in-person inspections of all the equipment that's been given away to police, but that just doesn't happen. And so the bill would mandate that and enforce in-person, regular inspections of equipment that we feel okay transferred from the war zone, whether it's office equipment or an automobile that comes from the war zone. Might as well give that to a police force. But where we have real problems with the armored personnel carriers, the tanks, the Humvees, the drones, the helicopters, assault weapons, grenade launchers, that does not belong in the U.S. police force or on our main streets.
I wonder what you see as the legal mechanisms. You mentioned some of the congressional funding. Is it all through Department of Homeland Security? Where are these programs coming from, and who lobbied for them?
That's a great question. So if folks listening want to get their member of the House or the Senate on board this stuff, I hope they call up their congressional office and say, hey, we want some accountability here, because it is up to Congress in 1997 that allowed the Department of Defense to transfer war zone equipment through this small little line item in U.S. code to pass over to U.S. police and U.S. Main Streets all these weapons from the war zone. And if your listeners, have problems with the Department of Homeland Security giving away tens of billions in these terrorism grants for police to kind of purchase whatever they want, they too should call up their member of Congress so that we have bipartisan support, because we've got bipartisan interest in the House because everyone from libertarians to progressive Democrats are upset, and we've got some hearings queued up for the Senate with Senator McCaskill taking the lead. So it's absolutely up to Congress. Now, in terms of some of the civil rights abuses that may have happened in Ferguson, ACLU is on board that, and they've done a lot of work here as well. And so there are some legal protections. I'm not a legal expert. I'm not a lawyer. We're here, the Friends Committee on National Legislation in D.C., trying to move legislation. But certainly there's some legal protections in terms of any civil rights abuses that come up in protest.
You mentioned that Congress program, the 1033 program, enacted in 1997, so 4 years before September 11th, 2001, and it was to dispense extra military gear from the military to police forces. You say to date the Pentagon donated military equipment worth over $4 billion to local law enforcement agencies.
That's correct.
Police in all 50 states get this stuff. Small towns all over America own these MRAP armored vehicles, for example, part of which inspired Representative Hank Johnson, to introduce this bill to block the 1033 program handouts. I'm just curious, way back in 1997, what was going on partly that inspired that? And this was a time when, at least in 1999, the Seattle, sort of world-famous Seattle protests happened, the sort of Teamsters and Turtles, kind of labor and environmentalists coming together protesting against trade regulations, the World Trade Organization, WTO back then. And in the ensuing couple of years, in 99 and 2000, there were protests against, for example, Biotechnology Industry Organization right here at Boston's Heinz Convention Center. There were protests in Washington, D.C. against World Bank and International Monetary Fund policies. These things began to expand, these demonstrations, regular people objecting to trade regulations that they had no say in, that a president with sort of individual say-so over U.S. foreign policy could decide, and Congress would just kind of ratify whole hog. And I wonder if what else laid behind the 1997 enactment of this 1033 program?
It's a great question. I mean, we've seen the militarization of our police happen over several decades. It was just different kinds of equipment, smaller equipment. You think of Vietnam, some of the equipment came back from the Vietnam War, but we didn't see any of the tanks rolling out then on our streets, but you did see assault weapons coming from Vietnam. So we've seen it trickle in. We've just, post-2001, really opened the floodgates to the militarization of our police. But in the late 90s, it's interesting, I was in Seattle at the time, living there, working for an environmental nonprofit and engaged in the protests against WTO at the time. And Seattle Police Chief Norm Stamper used heavy tactics against protesters and got a lot of criticism for using some of the same tear gas tactics, rubber bullets that you're seeing in Ferguson. I was a recipient of one of those rubber bullets. Well, what's interesting about Norm Stamper is he's come full circle and said he's had his own kind of mea culpa and about face, and said he has deep concerns about the militarization of U.S. police forces. We had him in a House hearing that Congressman Hank Johnson sponsored as testimony to the problematic trend of our U.S. police. So you're seeing police chiefs step out and say, this is a problematic trend. Even some of the folks who have used these same tactics in the past, and he's now a huge proponent of really integrated civilian, community-oriented policing techniques. He says that's the only way to keep the community safe, that kind of partnership. And we certainly wholeheartedly agree with his statements here at Friends Committee on National Legislation. So you're seeing people step out and throw up a flag and say this is really problematic.
Michael, Shank is our guest. If you're just joining us, he works on legislative affairs with the Friends Committee on National Legislation in Washington. Michael, you've also taken a look at not just the kind of weaponization of local American police forces, but where else in the world do these weapons go after the U.S. military is done with them and on to the next sort of splurge fun purpose of new weapons that happens every year in the military as part of the approximately $600 billion a year spent on defense or militarization.
Well, you're right to bring up the industry interest that you've already mentioned on the phone several times, because it's quite convenient after the DoD, Defense Department, has given 20,000 MRAPs from the war zone to U.S. police forces. That's how many they can pass along unless we stop this trend now. But once they've done that, when the next war comes along that requires MRAPs or Humvees or armored personnel carriers, well, they've already been gifted to U.S. police, so we turn back to the defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Raytheon, and say, hey, we need some new equipment. Let's build some new Humvees, some armored personnel carriers, some MRAPs for the new war zone. So it's a handy program for defense contractors who are looking for new contracts. Now, they're heavily lobbying here in Washington, D.C. A couple $100 million a year is spent lobbying Congress to ensure that the defense contractors are getting new contracts. So this deal of passing along to U.S. police is very convenient for defense contractors who need new equipment made for the next war zone. And we're certainly exporting, like Israel and some of the Scandinavian countries, we're exporting a lot of this equipment to other countries too. So this is a huge boon for the defense industry, no question.
And there's plenty of defense industry right here around the greater Boston region and Raytheon Corporation, among them in Andover, Massachusetts, but also many, many others. A lot of the Route 128 high technology belt around greater Boston gets huge amounts of military spending contracts, not just on computers, but also weapon systems. Patriot missiles manufactured right in Andover, Massachusetts by Raytheon and many, many others. Michael Shank, I wonder, you mentioned you were the recipient of it. Was it a rubber bullet? What was the circumstance?
Yeah, there was a peaceful protest happening in Seattle. Now, this is years ago, so let me recollect what happened. But it was midnight, and I believe we were singing, and the entire thing was peaceful, and there was kind of a line of very militarized cop in SWAT gear facing us down, and they must have we even had some council members with us, and they must have got a sign or a cue from somebody above, police chief Stamper perhaps, to fire on us, because up until that point we were peacefully standing there in helicopters circling above. But the rubber bullet was pretty sizable. It was a pretty sizable canister, a couple inches wide and high, enough to knock you down, and then add to that tear gas. So we've seen it before. Ferguson is not new. Ferguson is a pretty egregious example. Washington Post did a great story of how 3/4 of American towns over 50,000 in population have white majority police forces patrolling minority communities. And so the racial dynamic here and the racial injustice that comes up that is exacerbated by the militarization just makes for a very volatile, combustible situation. You had that a little bit in Seattle, but Seattle was more corporate interests ensuring that, or wanting to ensure that WTO proceedings went without incident. But clearly, when you had tens of thousands of protesters saying, no, we actually have some real concerns, we were able to shut down the conversation at the time.